Greetings, people of the interwebs. Jake here, and welcome to another edition of Reviews Over Brews. So, for those of you who don't know, maybe this is the first time you're watching this series, but essentially what I do is I review a show, movie, book, comic, whatever it may be, over my brew of choice. Hence the name, Reviews Over Brews. So, what I'm drinking on this edition is Weihenstephaner, which is the world's from the world's oldest brewery, brewed in Bavaria, Germany, and has been brewed since 1040 A.D. And this is one of my all-time favorite beers. It is a Hefeweiss beer, so it is this beautiful kind of golden color. And much like Hefeweizen, the style of beer kind of has like notes of like banana and cloves. So yeah, it's a fantastic beer. Probably more so in like the summertime because it is a lighter beer. But again, you can't really go wrong with German beer. It's one of the best kinds of beers in my humble opinion. So, cheers. All right. Now that we got that out of the way, so as you can tell by the description, the description. But the title of this video, I am reviewing the Dragonlance Chronicles. So, this is one of my all-time favorite book series. So I first discovered this book when I was in middle school. And I remember I read maybe about half of it, because I checked it out at the school library, but never finished it. And for the longest time, I could not remember the name of the series, who wrote it, or anything like that until many moons ago. Actually, not that long ago. Maybe like 3 years ago. I saw this on Amazon, like the trilogy, which I'll get into here in a little bit. And just the artwork alone, I immediately recognized it. So the first book is Autumn Twilight. It has featured three of the main characters, Flint Fireforge, Tannis Half-Elven, and Gold Moon, which I'll get into them here in a moment. So I immediately bought the trilogy because it was pretty cheap, and they're paperback. Because again, I remember I liked it when I was a young teenager, but I just never finished it, and so didn't really know where the story went from there. Because again, I'm pretty sure I got about halfway through it. So I was actually really excited to read it and actually finish it. And I'm really glad I did because, like I said, this is probably, outside of Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's work, this is probably one of my favorite fantasy books. It's this and Game of Thrones, like the Song of Ice and Fire novels, are in close contention. But I would say I would give Dragonlance Chronicles the slight edge purely because even though, and I'm kind of going a little off topic here, but even though I think the A Song of Ice and Fire novels, so the Game of Thrones books, I think are better written, because I do think George Martin, in my opinion, he's probably one of my favorite writers when it comes to like dialogue and characters. But all that to say, not to say not that the Dragonlance Chronicles are poorly written by any stretch, but they're just a lot of fun, and they're not quite as deep in like the lore and stuff like that as say Tolkien, because that's just hard to do anyways. Tolkien he's on a whole other level, and he's basically where every other fantasy author has been influenced by. But anywho, with that out of the way, so the first book, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, focuses on 8 characters. They're all lifelong friends who have kind of been on a hiatus for the last several years. They used to kind of be a group of adventurers, went on several different adventures, but been on hiatus for the last few years. And so they finally reconvened. What is the name of the inn? The Inn of the Last Home. For the first time in, again, several years. So the main characters are Tannis Half-Elven, Stern Brightblade, and Tannis is the leader, skilled fighter who detests fighting, is tormented by love for 2 women, the tempestuous swordswoman Kitiara and the enchanting elf maiden Lorana. Stern Brightblade Knight of Solamnia, once revered in the days before the Cataclysm, the knights have since fallen into disgrace. Sturm's goal, more important to him than life itself, is to restore the honor of the knighthood. Goldmoon, chieftain's daughter, bearer of the blue crystal staff, her love for a tribal outcast Riverwind leads them both on a dangerous quest in search of the truth. Riverwind, grandson of the Wanderer, given the blue crystal staff in a city where death flew on black wings, he barely escaped with his life, and that was only the beginning. So these two characters actually kind of are the insightful incident that sets the whole story off on their adventure. But the other characters, Raceland, Caramin's twin brother, magic user. Though his health is shattered, Raceland possesses great powers beyond his young age, but dark mysteries are concealed behind his strange eyes. Caramin, Raceland's twin brother and a warrior. A genial giant of a man, Caramin is the exact opposite of his twin. Raceland is the one person he cares for, and the one person he fears. Flint Fireforge, dwarf fighter. Tanis' old friend, the ancient dwarf regards these youngsters as his children. And he is easily my favorite dwarf outside of the dwarves in Tolkien's work, like Gimli, who's probably my favorite in Tolkien's work. So outside of like Gimli and a lot of the other dwarves from Tolkien's work, Flint Fireforge is my favorite dwarf in all of fantasy. So then lastly we have Tasselhoff Burrfoot, who's a Kinder, which is basically this world's equivalent of halflings. So Kinder are the nuisance race of Kryn. They're immune to fear, and consequently, trouble just seems to follow them around. And similarly to Flint Fireforge, Tasselhoff is probably my favorite halfling character in fantasy outside of Lord of the Rings. Just because he's such a lovable character and is always up to mischief. But that's kind of just the way that the Kinders work in this world is they have no malicious intent. They like shiny things and they get into trouble a lot because their curiosity gets the best of them. And so basically the first book centers on the 8 characters kind of reconvening at the inn, and my cat agrees that this is a really good book series. But this series basically kicks off with the first book, and again with Goldmoon and Riverwind having possession of this mysterious artifact that everyone seems to be chasing after, and kind of seems to be the key to helping restore the world to balance, because there's a lot of dark rumors going around of evil kind of seeping its way back into the world, and so that's kind of the general premise of the first book, is the characters kind of on the run, because their reunion immediately gets cut short. And so they then kind of are like forced to flee and just basically be on the run. And kind of gradually start trying to figure out the mysteries behind like the events going on in the world and the staff that Goldmoon is in possession of. And so I should also mention that Lorana, one of the characters that Tanis is sweet on, is also one of my favorite elf characters in all of fantasy. So even though she doesn't get introduced in the first book until the kind of the tail end, she really comes into the forefront in the second book, Dragons of Winter Night, which this is probably my favorite of the trilogy. And just to give you a little description, so now the people know that the dragon minions of Takisis, Queen of Darkness, have returned. The people of all nations prepare to fight to save their homes, their lives, their freedom. But the races have long been divided by hatred and prejudice. Elven warriors and human knights fight among themselves. It seems the battle has been lost before it begins. The companions are separated, torn apart by war. A full season will pass before they meet again, if they meet again. As the darkness deepens, a disgraced knight, a pampered elf maiden, and a rattle-brained Kinder stand alone in the pale winter sunlight. So on this book, it is featured Stern Brightblade, Lorana, and then Tasselhoff. So I think I like the dynamic of this book just because, as the description in the back says, so the characters are all kind of separated, and they're all off. They have the same goal in trying to get the Dragon Lances and the Dragon Orbs, because that's kind of the key to like stopping this. Because dragons have kind of returned to the world, and dragons are primarily a force of evil, and so that's kind of their main objective. Is they're all trying, like, they're split up, but they're all trying to get these dragon lances and orbs in these different locations. So this one focuses a little bit more on those three characters, so Sturm, Lorana, and Tasselhoff. And I don't know. To me personally, I think this is my favorite of the trilogy, and I think part of it is because it gets a little bit darker. It also starts to delve a lot more into like the lore of like the Knights of Slumnia, and it also introduces. Well, actually, that might be a bit of a spoiler. Granted, these books have been out since like the '80s, but on the off chance that this is your first time hearing about this series, or it's a series you've heard about but haven't read yet, I don't want to spoil something. I don't know. Again, even though this stuff is easily accessible, like if you look it up online, I'm sure you can find a lot of spoilers. Just because you just happen to look it up. But yeah, Dragons of Winter Night is probably my favorite of the three. But then we get the third book, which is Dragons of Spring Dawning. And here we have Caraman, Raistlin, and Kitiara. So Kitiara is the sister to Caraman and Raistlin. I believe she's the eldest of the three. And so she becomes a bit more prominent in the third book. I would say she's still more of a supporting character in like the grand scheme of things, but this is definitely where she kind of her role is beefed up a lot. And I do like, without giving a whole lot away, I do like her character and kind of how she, I guess how she her role plays into the story because she's definitely a bit of an outlier compared to the rest of the characters and their quests and stuff like that. And so, Dragons of Spring Dawning is the conclusion to this trilogy, which the war against the dragon minions of Queen Takesis rages on. Armed with the mysterious magical dragon orbs and the shining silver dragonlance, the companions bring hope to the world. But now, in the dawn of a new day, the dark secrets that have long shadowed the hearts of their friends come to light. Betrayal, treachery, frailty, weakness will nearly destroy all that they have accomplished. The greatest battle they have left to fight is within each of them. Yet in the end, they will be heroes. And so this book, I think, is a good conclusion. It's not like an overall conclusion because I mean, there's tons of books in this series. Most of which are written by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, who are the ones who started the trilogy. But there are several spin-off books written by other authors. But typically, from what I've gathered, because I've only read those three books and then Dragons of Summer Flame, which I'll get into here in a moment. From what I gather, though, most of the books that weren't written by Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss are not as good. And so a lot of people said that, primarily stick to the ones written by those two. But I can't, say for myself, because again, I've only read 4 of the books. But there are a ton. So if you're an avid reader, you like fantasy, and you're wanting a book series that has an almost endless supply of books, Dragonlance is the way to go. And also, I don't know if you all noticed, but at the top, you can see Dungeons and Dragons. So this actually is set in one of the Dungeons and Dragons multiverses. And I think it was actually about 2 years ago, maybe even last year, there was a module released where you can actually play on the continent of Ansalon, where these stories take place, rather than the main the main D&D world that a lot of those modules take place in. But yeah, so you will notice a lot of like similar, like again, if you're familiar with like D&D lore and stuff like that, you will notice some familiar like names of like races, some of the gods and stuff like that, and a little bit too of like some of the magic and all of that. But then, so after that trilogy, we have Dragons of Summer Flame, and this actually takes place 20 years after the events of the original trilogy. And this book Um, Overall, I enjoyed, but I don't like it quite as much as the previous three. Main reason being is like I said, it takes place 20 years after the events of the first three books. And so it focuses on new characters. So summer has come to Kryn, a summer unlike any before. The sun sears the world with relentless light and heat, and even the darkness of night brings little relief from the strange and oppressive day. Those who commune regularly with their gods are uneasy, for every day their deities become more distant, more difficult to reach. As the tension on Ansalon builds, estranged cousins Palin Magir and Steel Brightblade are thrown together by a bizarre twist of fate. Each one fights a battle within himself, but when they meet a mysterious young woman who claims to be the daughter of an infamous mage, Raceland Magir, named Usha, everything changes. It soon becomes evident that more than their own lives are at stake. The fate of all Kryn hangs in the balance. So this primarily focuses on Palin, Steel, and Usha, which I like all three of those characters. But I kind of would have liked a little bit more from the legacy characters, and some of them do play a large part or large role in this book, like Tanis, who's actually featured on the front there, along with Usha and Palin there. So Palin is the son of Karaman, and then Steel is the son of Sturm. And then Usha is, claiming to be the daughter of Raceland, which, as the book progresses, we find out, if that's true or not. But basically, I would have liked a little bit more focus on some of the legacy characters. Again, Tanis does play a pretty large role, same thing with Tasselhoff. But I was a little bummed that Lorana doesn't play a very large role at all. Like, I think she's only in like one scene in one of the chapters in this book, and she was one of my favorite characters. But basically, Dragons of Summer Flame is the kind of, I guess you could say, true conclusion to the events that started in Dragons of Autumn Twilight. And it seems like some fans are a little, like, kind of divided on the book. Like, I think most people seem to overall enjoy it, but kind of the same thought process as me, where they enjoyed it, but it's not quite as good as the first three books. But all that to say, it's still worth reading. But even if you don't bother with like Dragons of Summer Flame, just these three alone are a solid read, and would highly recommend. Let's also be noted that since this book does take place 20 years later, there's other books that take place, or stories that are written that take place kind of before this. Like there's a whole trilogy of books that follow Karaman and Raceland after the events of the first three books, which I haven't read. I think there's maybe some other books, but even though I hadn't read those books, there's definitely some characters featured in this book that I knew nothing about, and like some references to like events and stuff like that that happened. But I still feel like it's not entirely necessary to have read all those other books to read this one. It definitely helps just because you'll be more familiar with like some of the characters and like some of the things that they reference or that are referenced. But as a whole, you could read the first three books and then jump straight to this one like I did. But as a whole, though, I think this is a must-read for any fantasy fan because it's an iconic series, and to me, it has pretty much everything a fantasy reader would want in a book. It's got a lot of great characters, a super fun storyline, and dragons, magic. A little bit of romance in there, and it's definitely got like some moments of levity, so that way when things do get a little intense at times, you've got your moments of levity to kind of like bring things down before ratcheting up the tension again. So yeah, this series, I can't stress enough, is one of my all-time favorites, and also has a lot of reading qualities about it, because they're really not super long. Like, this is the longest, and I believe it is... Let me double check real here. 583 pages to get to the epilogue. So that's definitely a much lengthier book compared to the others, which is all around 300 something. So not a huge... not super daunting task to read, something that's around 300 pages. and they're pretty easy read as a whole too. So you can kind of just fly right through them. Like I believe I read, I think all three of the first books within about 2 weeks each, maybe like week and a half, 2 weeks for each book, because I just enjoyed them that much. So yeah, like I said though as well is if you're a fantasy fan and you have not read these books, I think it is a must. Uh, if it's not a must to like add to your library of fantasy books, I think it's at least a must to read. But I don't see why someone wouldn't enjoy these books. Now, whether they're like one of your favorite book series or you enjoyed them, but you're like, yeah, I'm cool just reading them once. Totally fine, but I do think they're a must read for any fantasy fan. But I also like to think that, again, if you're a fantasy fan, you gotta at least have these three books in your collection. Because again, just the artwork in all three books are solid, and really all the books are pretty solid, even the ones that I haven't read. I like the artwork. Um, so it's got great artwork, solid characters, really fun story. And again, what more do you want? Dragons, magic, evil, good versus evil, and dragons in the mix. Come on, it's all anyone ever wants in fantasy. So that more or less wraps up my review. I know this is definitely a longer episode, but I kind of wanted to review the whole series rather than just do one book at a time. Unless you all are, I don't know, I guess if this does gets enough views or intrigue, I can do individual reviews of the books. But that was kind of my general um, review of those first four books. But hopefully you enjoyed. If you haven't read the Dragonlance Chronicles, hopefully I've piqued your interest. And if you have read the books, what is your favorite book and which are your favorite characters? And what are some other good books in this series that you would recommend to me? So that way I can check them out and read them. And actually, I will say before I wrap this up, so I believe these books are currently being reprinted. So I was actually going to get the first three books as a Christmas gift and couldn't find like physical copies, well, new physical copies, I should say, that were in, like there's some that were in good condition, but I didn't want to give a Christmas gift that was like a used book. However, again, if you're wanting to get into this book series, next month, I forget what day exactly, but sometime next month, early next month, I want to say, there's a fancy hardback book that encompasses the first three books all in one. So you can pre-order it right now and have yourself the first three books in this nice, lovely hardback edition and read them at your leisure. But that wraps up this review. Hopefully you have enjoyed, and until next time, everyone, cheers.